Every now and then in your Next.js applications, you might find that you need to fetch data sequentially. So you make one fetch request, you wait until that fully completes, and then you make the next fetch request. And if we look at the code for this sequential data fetching page, what you see is that we first fetch our user here, and then we fetch our posts. And since our posts are dependent on the user ID, we kind of have to do this sequentially. If you didn't have to do this sequentially and your second request did not rely on the result of your first request, like our post request relying on the user ID here within the URL, if it didn't rely on it, then you could kick off both of these requests at the same time and then use something like promise.all to kind of concurrently fetch this data. But in the case to where they are dependent on each other, there is a better way to kind of structure this page, because right now our second request takes 2 seconds, our first request takes half of a second. So to load this entire page, it's going to take about 2.5 seconds. And if we come back to the page here, let me open up the network tab. And if we look at how long it takes to load this page or this document, it's going to take a little over 2.5 seconds, which isn't ideal. To show you this maybe even a little better here, if I go to just our home Next.js page, and then we navigate to the sequential data fetching page, you're going to see that it's just going to sit here on our home page for about 2.5 seconds until we load our sequential data fetching page, which it would be great if we could kind of improve this user experience a little bit to where maybe we could render out the page when this first request is complete, but then we show like a loader for our post component until that request completes. And with Next.js kind of loading and streaming, you can do exactly that. So if we go to my streaming page, we still have our initial request to get our user, but now on this page, we render a suspense component with a fallback, and we render a separate posts component. So we've kind of split out our posts UI, this UI right here. We've split that out into its own component, and then we just pass the user ID down to this component. And then in the post component, this is where we make the fetch request for the post with the user ID and then render out our posts. But what this allows us to do is we can now just render out this post component with a suspense component wrapped around it, which is going to have the effect of we're going to be able to render this streaming page as soon as the user request completes. And then in the meantime, we will render out this suspense component with a loader until our post request completes. So if we go look at the streaming page here and just kind of make a mental note here, when I go to the streaming page and navigate to it, just think about how quick this feels compared to going to the sequential page. We see it much sooner, and then we load in the posts later. So if I refresh the page, we load our user, and then our posts come in later. But the overall experience here just feels a little bit better. It still takes about 2.5 seconds to render the whole page, but to show you this maybe even a little better, if we go to our home page and we go to our streaming page, you can see that only after half of a second, we actually get to the page and then we render in the post later. So the user could even interact with this page a little bit early. Whereas if we come back to our home page and then we go to sequential, it just sits here for a long amount of time and then it renders the entire page and then we can finally interact with it, which is not the ideal experience. And I think the experience of our streaming page is much better here, to where we kind of progressively stream this page to prevent it just kind of being blocking the entire time. Now, one other important detail here is if we go to our sequential page and you see it takes a while, it just makes the whole kind of application here feel pretty slow. But if I refresh this page and then I click show details, just kind of watch the experience that we see. So I'm going to refresh the page. I'm going to click show details. And then you see the modal just kind of disappears. So I refresh, show details, and then it kind of removes the modal altogether. And that's because We've refreshed the page, and although we can still click the show details button, the entire page gets loaded in and then kind of wipes out that state and removes that button. Whereas on the streaming page, if I do a refresh of the page here and I click show details, what you see is our posts render in, but our modal still stays because we still rendered our entire page when we first see it, and then we can still interact with it. So it also improves the interactivity of your page quite a bit by having this sort of streaming behavior. So hopefully this example makes it clear that kind of streaming that data in can really improve that user experience. So just to kind of recap here, if you need to fetch data sequentially, so one fetch request relies on the other, using streaming is probably a pretty good solution to improve your user experience. And the way that you can do that is for the UI that you want to show from your subsequent request, your request that relies on your other request, you can break that into its own component and then wrap that with the suspense component that you import from React. For that suspense component, you need to give it a fallback. In our case, we just pass in a paragraph tag that says loading post, but this could be a different loader. But you use this suspense component, importing it directly from React, and then you can render your component that is going to make that kind of secondary request. And then that request can occur in that component itself. And when that request completes, it will return all the UI here. But in the meantime, we're going to show this fallback component of loading posts, which is why you see in our streaming here, we see loading posts, and then that is rendered in. But in the meantime, the rest of our page is still going to be interactive here, kind of the top portion of this page that isn't wrapped in the suspense, which in my opinion is going to be a much better user experience. The user is going to be able to see that page sooner if they're originally navigating to it. And overall, I just think it's a much better kind of UI and UX of streaming that data in when you have sequential data fetches, rather than just making it all be blocking for that entire page. And whenever possible, if your fetch requests are not sequential here and they're not dependent on each other, then fetch these requests kind of concurrently, make the fetch request at the same time. And then instead of just awaiting each request here, you could use something like promise.all and then wait for the request to resolve that way, rather than kind of having a waterfall effect here. So hopefully this video kind of helps you out. This is a pretty common UX case that you might run into. So hopefully this helps. Hopefully you learned something. If you have any questions, let me know down below, and I will see you in that next video.